Thank you very much, Ms. Magrigian.
Thank you. Anyway, my name is Astrid Magrigian. Good job on the name. Thank you so much. And on behalf of the California Medical Association, we do appreciate the opportunity to discuss the impact of the bar on accessibility, affordability, and quality of healthcare in this state.
Great, and we appreciate you being here. You're an important part of this the ingredient.
As we just saw, there's been some debate about the contours of the corporate bar, but there's really no doubt that the goal of the corporate bar to protect patients and put their medical interests first has served patients well in this state. The bar does ensure that physicians' medical judgment won't be compromised, and it makes sense because it is the physicians that have gone through medical school and had the training, and they are licensed by the medical board, and they're subject to the medical disciplinary powers of the medical board. And they are the ones that have the ethical obligations and understand the quality care implications of their medical decisions. To do this, the bar, with some exceptions as we saw, provides a front-end structural safeguard that prohibits lay control over the practice of medicine, largely through the employment or contracting with physicians for the provision of services. Because of the profound quality implications, it doesn't rely on the goodwill of people to say, okay, I will respect your medical decision-making in a contract, but rather prohibits it at the outset to prevent lay entities from exercising medical control. I have been working with CMA or on behalf of CMA for over 30 years now. We have all seen the changes to healthcare in the system. And the bar has served, and I have witnessed the bar serving patients well throughout these years and to ensure that their care is being placing their interests first. Recent health reform efforts and related delivery payment system reforms that reward value over volume really confirm the need for continuation of the bar. CMA absolutely supports health reform efforts that result in quality, affordable health care. However, those goals cannot be realized without continuation of the bar. Let's talk about quality. In the last 10 years, I have been an expert witness in a number of criminal cases where they have raised the corporate bar violations as a violation in insurance fraud cases, basically. The ones that are currently, that means they've been in the courts just in 2016, I just want to briefly, if you don't mind, talk about them. One of them was a chiropractor that ended up doing a sham medical corporation. I won't bore you with the technicalities of it, but basically he got a doctor with a pulse to be the 51% shareholder in a medical corporation, which is one of the safeguards of professional corporations. There's many safeguards in these exceptions, and I won't go through them right now. But in any event, so there's this, I'm going to just call it fake or absentee medical director over this professional corporation. And they went ahead and independently contracted with different physicians from different parts of the area and used their DEA numbers to actually purchase medications. And these independent contractors were told at these medical clinics to prescribe as much as possible. And the reason they were told that was because the clinics, through the chiropractor, purchased the medications. It was mostly painkillers and muscle relaxants, and were selling them to patients at a profit, and made a huge amount of money making profit over the medications to the patients. Unnecessary medication, high health care costs, and enormous profit to the chiropractor, who was convicted last month of insurance fraud, and through those profits is paying them to his attorney to deal with post-conviction motions. Another case that is in front of a grand jury today involves someone who didn't do the sham medical clinic, but just formed clinics all throughout Southern California, but they weren't licensed under the Health and Safety Code. They didn't have an exemption under the Health and Safety Code. Just call them clinics for the heck of it. And he independently contracted with physicians, illegal under the corporate bar, and he told them to see as many patients as possible, to refer every single patient for an MRI, regardless of medical need, to have a psychiatric evaluation, regardless of mental health care need, and exposing these patients to lots and lots of unnecessary medical treatment and evaluation, higher costs. And not only was it, of course, the costs to the system, but these patients now, if they do have a subsequent medical injury, under the workers' comp laws, it's going to look like they were prior injured when they were not. Kitty Juniper was talking about the courts and the medical board and how they have talked about the contours of the bar. Well, what they have done is they've actually come up with lots of factors that constitute the practice of medicine. they have to be, doctors have to be in control of who patients are referred to. Doctors have to be in charge of the diagnostic tests. Well, one of these, and I know this is not the best example, but I just can't shake it out of my head. One of them was that doctors have to be in charge of supplies and they have to be in charge of infection control. Makes sense, right? In this particular clinics, in these clinics, they didn't even change the sterile paper all day. I just found that disgusting. Okay, you can say, well, okay, we can have, we can keep the corporate bar for these non-hospitals, but hospitals are different. Hospitals too are concerned about their bottom line, as they should be. And what we need to make sure is that patients are still placed first and that the hospital's bottom line doesn't jeopardize that notion. With respect to hospitals, there's a subset of laws, so not like the corporate bar, which is a front-end protection. There's a back-end protection called medical staff self-governance. And with medical staff self-governance, what it says is that medical staffs must be responsible for the professional work performed in a hospital, the quality of care issues. It's a condition of licensure under Title 22. It's a joint commission requirement. Joint commission accredits hospitals. And it's also unprofessional conduct for physicians to practice in a hospital without a self-governing medical staff. And unfortunately, this is a back-end protection. It relies on the goodwill of the hospital to abide by the law. It relies on enforcement. And I appreciated your comments about most doctors being ethical, but it's not really just an issue about being ethical. Because to enforce back-end as opposed to front-end protections, you need to have the temerity. You need to have the market presence to be able to withstand a challenge against a hospital for medical staff self-governance. You need to have the funds to be able to go to court. So, medical staff self-governance, unfortunately, has not been a perfect solution. What did we see up in Reading? We saw, the cardiologists being treated incredibly well as a result of their high admissions and as a result of their unnecessary cardiac care services. Not going to mention it, Southern California, system that's wound its way up here. Very, very aggressive policies admitting patients unnecessarily out of the ED into an inpatient group. We have seen doctors that have been retaliated against and lost their medical staff privileges because of whistleblower lawsuits. And we have seen injurious medical guidelines coming out of hospitals. We heard about the Dignity Health one. I'm going to bring that up in a few more minutes, just quickly. We've heard it twice, so you don't need it. I have another little bit. But I do want to talk about a medical guideline that was from a military hospital in a non-corporate bar state. Okay, so military non-corporate board, so double bangy. And in this particular hospital, Lord knows why, but they had a requirement for women that were doing vaginal births after a cesarean. And in this military hospital said, if you can choose women. If you want to have a cesarean, you can have a cesarean. If you want to have a VBAC, easier way to say it. If you want to have a VBAC, you have a VBAC. But the minute labor starts, you can't change your mind. And only the doctor, this is the hospital policy, only the doctor can change, can make the decision to do a cesarean. This woman had a prior hysterectomy. Actually, she had 2 prior hysterectomies. Not hysterectomies, cesareans. And she wanted to try a VBAC because, let's face it, cesareans are pretty risky. And in fact, the blood clots that form from them can kill you. And so she wanted to go for a VBAC. Her doctor that she'd chosen to deliver was a family practice physician and wasn't credentialed to do a cesarean. She was told that. She goes to the hospital, make a very long story short, she's beginning to have problems. She hears the nurses saying, ooh, this is going on a little too long. They start giving her Pitocin, the labor-inducing thing. She starts getting some pretty bad pain. She hears more nurses. She asked for a cesarean. And she asked it to her physician who couldn't do it. She asked it to the nurses. She asked to other physicians in there, and no one would give it to her. Finally, the physician in charge comes down that can perform cesareans, and he says, no, you can do this, let's keep, I don't think it's medically necessary yet. So she keeps going along until the point where there was fetal bradycardia, the lack of oxygen. And the doctor actually waited 29 minutes to perform the cesarean, at which point in time her uterine ruptured, she had a hysterectomy, and the child had cerebral palsy. That's an example of, two counts where guidelines just are not helpful that come from non-practicing physicians. But with all this integration, with all this health reform, don't we need integration? We heard about the study that talked about patients that, choose physicians from independent practice, tend to choose higher quality, lower cost hospitals. I want to point out that came from Stanford. Those were Stanford researchers that did that. And there's other studies that have really questioned the impact on quality and whether or not some of this integration is really just relating to higher costs. So let's talk about costs and affordability, which is the second goal of health reform. There's two questions. What is the some people say, well, it's going to be cheaper for hospitals to employ physicians. So, is that true? And what is the cost to society as in actual cost in terms of dollars and cents to patients? And, if you just kind of Google it, and I don't know if Mr. Google knows my predilection on these issues, but it's pretty clear from when you internet search this stuff that the costs are pretty high. On both ends. Studies vary in terms of the estimate on how much it costs to hire a physician. They go from $100,000 to primary care physicians to $250,000 over a 3-year period for specialists. So there's some pretty high costs there. Reasons that I have read for the costs of employment vary. Some of the physicians bring with them different patient-based. Some of it has to do with productivity of physicians. And so now they're thinking, okay, well, now we need to, that makes no sense if we're having productivity-based, issues. But then you don't want them more productive because then you're going back to a volume over value thing. So now, hospitals in other states are toying with doing some sort of value-based compensation. But at that point, they're looking like Knox-Keene plans and need further regulation. So that gets kind of messy. Cost to society. The studies are pretty uniform that combined market power of physicians and hospitals do result in higher costs and higher premiums, so much to the extent that our Attorney General just last year filed an amicus curiae brief in an antitrust lawsuit trying to halt the merger of a physician group and hospital, saying, gee, this is going to cost money, it's going to result in higher costs, and it's not clear it's going to increase quality. Another thing that's going on with hospitals is that when physicians work for hospitals and hospital systems, there's something called a facility fee. And MedPAC, which is the independent commission that oversees the Medicare program, estimates that when you have these formerly outpatient services that are done in a hospital, the facility fee can make the cost of the service up to 80% more for that service. Now, Congress admittedly last year did something to try and fix that, but it's it's not at all sufficient. It doesn't apply to any schemes in existence until November of 2015, only applies to services that are off campus, broadly defined, and doesn't apply until 2017 in any event. Accessibility, the third prong. Okay, I'll start with the Dignity Health case. That woman, by the way, in that case, they had two policies. One of them was that you couldn't even have a VBAC if you had a cesarean first. And so that was a medical policy that was harmful. Now, this particular woman did want a cesarean, but because she was denied one there, she lost access to services in that entire community because there was nowhere else in that entire community where she could have gotten a hysterectomy. So depending upon what the wills and the medical dictates of the hospitals are, it does impact accessibility. The other area where it impacts accessibility is with costs, because once a hospital employs a physician, the end of game. You got to get all your care. If you want to see that physician, you got to get all your care through that hospital. And the care from that physician through that hospital, and particularly given the facility fee, the costs, the out-of-pocket cost of that physician is not in your plan or your network within your plan, the costs can be exorbitant. especially with that 80% tack on. Rural hospitals, I know there's been challenges with rural hospitals. I just want to say that CMA has been a long supporter of the Stephen Thompson loan repayment program, and it's resulted in literally hundreds of physicians that are going to rural areas and practicing in medically underserved areas. It's funded through physicians, and that under federal law, I'm almost done. Under federal law, the law does allow hospitals to make payments to physicians to relocate to hospitals and to stay there. And there's protections in the federal law to make sure, number one, that physicians aren't referring referring to the hospital just for those payments, and two, that patients have choices to see physicians elsewhere, because those physicians must, as a condition of those payments, be able to get medical staff privileges elsewhere. Bear with me. Myths. A couple of myths I want to talk about. Hospitals need to integrate to do business. Well, we heard about the fact that I heard them referred to as wraparounds. I don't really think them as wraparounds. I mean, there's the co-management agreements, there's the foundations, there's the MSOs. There's a number of ways that physicians can integrate without financially integrating with hospitals. But there's checks and balances. Kitty Jim, again, getting back to the fact that the courts have delineated what constitutes the practice of medicine. When medical groups contract with hospitals and other entities, they have the professional services agreement that incorporates all of the aspects of the corporate bar, such as sterile paper and supplies and medical control, that allows them to, have the checks and balances in the system when they're contracting for these clinical integration strategies with hospitals that really does protect the corporate bar. Next, hospitals would employ if they could. A couple years ago, CMA does not oppose every corporate bar exemption. In fact, CMA was fine with the specialty pediatric exemption that was listed up there. That was just in 2012. One of the interesting things that came out in the report was there were 8 hospitals that were qualified for that exemption. And as far as I could tell from that report, only 3 actually aligned themselves with physicians, and it wasn't even in an employment model. It was through a contract model, the type that we've been talking about. So they didn't do that. Nor was there a lot of, quite honestly, contracting with hospital districts from the pilot project that happened in 2003. Why bother, since there were so many exemptions? The exemptions, I do want to point out about a couple of the exemptions.
Oh, I'm sorry?
I just wanted to make a couple of points about the exemptions. I'm sorry. The county hospital exemption, for example, we're talking about 12 county hospitals. I mean, exemptions are there for a reason, right? I mean, there's exemptions all over the law, right? Our Constitution prohibits usury. You can't charge more than 10% interest. There's lots of exemptions to that. If there's a community need, if you're affiliated with a federal bank. I mean, there's lots of good reasons for lots of exemptions. County hospitals, those physicians are able to unionize, unlike other physicians. Another big exemption is HMOs. HMOs, there is a ton of regulatory protections in the Knox-Keene Act where that would, might make sense. So happens Kaiser does not employ physicians. Actually, it's an independent medical group that contracts with the health plan, just like the type we were talking about. Right. Medical schools. Medical schools, there's about 6%, as I read the numbers in the report, about 6% of California physicians are employed by a medical school. And there's good reason for that. I mean, medical schools, their very job is to teach physicians to exercise independent decision-making, number one. Number two, they need to, because they need that clinical income to help them with their critically important mission to train our future caregivers. There's other good reasons. Anyway, finally, California. Huh?
Okay, no, go ahead. Finally, thank you.
Finally, okay. I'm sorry. California is not a lone wolf, as we saw. There are over half the states in California do have some sort of corporate bar, and rather than calling us a lone wolf, we are a leader in healthcare quality and innovation. ACOs have been in California for a really long time through various forms because of the innovation that we have done. And there are actual studies that talk about the physician-led ACOs throughout the country and including California that say that they are providing actually better quality results than those that are not physician-led. Our built-in system of checks and balances have put us there, and we should not jeopardize either patient care or our leader status in healthcare by stripping patients of vital patient care protections. Happy to answer questions. Thank
Very
you
good.
so
Thank
much.
you very much for the testimony. Just a couple come to mind. One, you mentioned about the rural hospitals and how you support that, and you certainly indicated debt forgiveness and all these other things, but you have been opposed to the pilot programs in the past to extend that pilot program for allowing hospitals to employ physicians in those rural areas.
It is my understanding, I'm a contractor with CMA, so I'm not involved in their day-to-day things, but it is my understanding they're working on a compromise right now.
Well, let's hope so.
Yeah.
That'd be great. Thank
Yeah.
you. And then the other, do you feel that that CPM should be applied to other healthcare professions?
Yes. Yes, if you are treating patients in your scope of practice requires that you do it independently and allows that you do it independently, then, and the law says, the California Supreme Court cases have provided that, that bar should apply with equal protection to remove any possibility that your medical or healthcare judgment will not be compromised.
And then what do you believe is the government's role in regulating competition between healthcare providers? Because what we see today is, obviously we have a lack of competition in a certain way. Some would look at the fact that what you've been able to do, or not you, but what the CPM has been able to do in California is provide almost a collective bargaining agreement or the ability to negotiate contracts as a body rather than the fear perhaps of having a hospital negotiate with one doctor and then picking off another doctor here, getting another physician here in this practice and that. Now you come in as a group practice and the group can establish their own demands and pretty much control the market.
Well, the antitrust laws really recognize and understand marketplace dynamics. If you are a group of independently contracting physicians that have created no economies of scale, created no clinical, efficiencies, you don't go by clinical guidelines, you're not sharing resources, you're not looking at each, you're not performing peer review and doing all the things that really improve quality, and you're just nakedly saying we're not going to contract with you unless you contract with us, that's an antitrust violation, and that should be prohibited as such. But if, on the other hand, you're a medical group that's really united and has the clinical integration tools that really improve quality, then the only issue remaining is, are you a monopoly? And as I understand it, the courts and the Attorney General have the full power to look at that and look at it on a case-by-case basis.
Okay, very good. Thank you. Other questions? Seeing none? Ms. Bourguignon, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Mr. Barcelona, thank you very much. We have about 35, probably maybe 40 minutes to go. So let's take our next panel, please. And that's perspectives from hospitals, healthcare districts, and nurse practitioners. John Zweifler, thank you. Zweifler and Kevin Flanagan from Northern Inyo Healthcare District on behalf of the Association of California Healthcare District. And John Zweifler is with the Regional Medical Director, Adventist Health Plan on behalf of the California Hospital Association, and Carolyn Buppert, Attorney Law Office of Carolyn Buppert on behalf of the California Association of Nurse Practitioners. Thank you very much, and I hope I got that right. And if we could begin with Dr. Zweifler.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Chairperson Hill and the panel. And I must say, as a lifetime political junkie, it's a thrill and an honor to be able to present before a legislative committee for the first time in my life. My name is Dr. John Zweifler. I've been a practicing family physician for 30 years here in California, primarily working in ambulatory settings with patients of all ages, mainly with rural and underserved populations. I've also worked for a number of years in inpatient settings, delivering babies and providing urgent care as well. I've also been involved in hiring physicians in multiple settings as a medical director for both community health centers and for rural health clinics, and as program director-in-chief for the UCSF Fresno Family Medicine Residency Program for 15 years. More recently, I've had administrative roles, including with the California Department of Corrections and Rehab for 5 years, and I'm currently the Regional Medical Director for Adventist Health Plan, or AHP. AHP is a managed care plan that is at risk for cost and quality for Medi-Cal patients in Kings County. I want to speak to three aspects pertaining to the prohibition on hospitals hiring physicians. The first is the practice preferences of our graduating residents. The second is the unique challenges for recruiting to rural areas. And the third is the implications of healthcare reform. When I was accepted into medical school in the 1970s, I was grateful for the opportunity to be a physician. It is a profession where you're able to help others, you're respected in the community, it's intellectually challenging, and you're well compensated. It's truly a privilege to be a physician. Based on my experience, the physicians that are graduating today have a similar perspective on medicine, but they also value their personal life and time. I'm not sure if this is a function of being Generation X or a millennial, but I think it has more to do that doctors are people too. They are wary of open-ended positions that require 24/7 commitments, and they prefer positions that are more structured and have a predictable schedule, and for this reason they value opportunities in things like emergency rooms, urgent care, and even we see the growth of hospitalists where shift work is more prominent. Another important point to remember is that physicians graduate with MD degrees and DO degrees. They're not MBAs, they're not attorneys. Many new graduates feel like they need advanced degrees to navigate the thick of insurance plans, IPAs, PPOs, co-pays, narrow networks that confound physicians just as much as they confuse your constituents. Now it's not just about hiring a good nurse, it's about hiring a biller, a coder, and an office manager. The other reality for graduating residents is that all those student loans they accumulated over a decade of being in medical school and then residency in college must now be paid off. Many residents graduate owing several $100,000, so the prospect of borrowing further to set up a practice is daunting. A physician starting a new practice also lacks the expertise in the cloud of large organizations to negotiate effectively on reimbursement rates with hard-nosed health plans and medical service organizations. Then there's the cost and complexity of purchasing and maintaining an electronic medical record, not for the faint of heart. Not only must the physicians learn to use the EMR without negatively impacting patient flow, but they must document the quality of the care they provide to be eligible for complicated pay-for-performance programs and to comply with rigorous meaningful use documentation standards that are associated with the use of electronic health records. All of these factors have pushed graduates that I've worked with to turn in increasing numbers towards an employment model such as Kaiser. At UCSF Fresno, we trained residents to work in rural underserved communities, and so I was proud that many of them were attracted to working in community health centers where they were offered the opportunity for direct employment. Because of the restrictions on hospitals, the rural hospitals I work with now in the Central Valley cannot hire physicians directly, and I believe this has hampered our recruitment efforts. Moving to the second point, I want to address rural areas and their particular challenges attracting physicians. The fact that it's difficult to recruit to rural areas is demonstrated by that rural areas have a disproportionate number of medically underserved designations. Because of the smaller and more diffuse populations in rural areas, it is harder for physicians to achieve a critical mass of colleagues to ensure a stable and sustainable work-life balance. In the past, heroic doctors would single-handedly provide the majority of care needed in their communities. If you're in a small town, there's a demand for a doctor who will take care of your aging parent and juggle their 10 or 15 medications. You want them to also be able to take care of your child when they're sick, when they're throwing up, when they have a fever. You want a physician who's able to take care of you when you're pregnant, when you sprain your ankle, fall and break your wrist, when you need a pap smear, when your ingrown toenail is acting up, and when you need to drain that painful abscess. When I began my family medicine training in 1981, our program director was Dr. Weber, an old-fashioned doctor in the best sense of the word, who performed appendectomies and cholecystectomies when necessary. There are fewer and fewer Dr. Webers these days, and a spectrum of primary care and specialists are now needed to meet the healthcare needs in rural communities that in the past were managed by a few physicians with multiple skills who are willing to be on call 24/7. There are multiple reasons for this, including the work-life issues discussed earlier. Regulatory agencies have also rightly pushed to standardize the qualifications of physicians who perform various procedures, but this also means that it is harder for a single primary care physician to be privileged to perform specialty procedures. Pressures to generate visits in office setting also contribute to pushing primary care physicians to consult or turf complex patients sooner rather than later. All of these factors increase demand for specialty services in rural areas and elsewhere. Hospitals are better positioned than private practitioners to develop a specialty network and coordinate physician services throughout their service area. Using hub-and-spoke models of care to extend services into remote areas and technologies such as telemedicine, rural hospitals can improve access to specialty services. There are other challenges in rural areas as well. The generally lower incomes of rural populations means there's a higher percentage of Medi-Cal patients in rural areas, and limited reimbursement for Medi-Cal services makes it difficult to survive financially as a physician in rural communities. I've seen this in the communities Adventist Health serves, such as in Kingsburg, where the one private practice in town has shrunk from 4 partners to 1, and the towns of Selma and Reedley, where practicing physicians are retiring, and no one has stepped in to take their practices. One way to address this is to establish rural health clinics, which are eligible for cost-based reimbursement from Medi-Cal that pays better than traditional fee-for-service. This is a strategy that Adventist Health has pursued. Some of the rural communities where I work in, such as Lemoore, Orange Cove, and Parlier, are served by both community health centers, which also receive cost-based reimbursement from Medi-Cal, and by rural health centers sponsored by Adventist Health. If a graduating physician wants to work with a community health center, they are hired directly. If they want to work with Adventist, they are signed to independent contractor contracts or hired through Adventist Medical Foundation that is headquartered in Sacramento. The stakes are high if you invest in setting up a practice in a small rural community, then find that for whatever reason, be it professional, such as low volumes or limited reimbursement, or personal, such as a spouse who wants to move closer to a big city, that it's not working out. If rural hospitals were able to hire physicians, some of these concerns could be ameliorated. Hospitals are the largest and most stable healthcare entity in most rural communities and are in the best position to provide the security that a young physician wants. Rural hospitals do have options for attracting physicians. Hospitals can and do assist physicians in setting up practice, but this is risky for physicians and the hospital if the practice doesn't take off and the length of time that support can be offered is limited. Hospitals can also contract with clinicians as independent contractors, but as mentioned earlier, more and more graduates are looking for salaried options. One workaround is for hospitals to create a separate medical foundation, which in turn hires the physician, but the cost of maintaining a parallel personnel structure for physicians that is distinct from other employees is substantial and is inherently a duplication of effort. I am seeing a steadily growing number of physicians electing to sign up as employees with the medical foundation rather than plowing through the legal and business hurdles associated with becoming an independent contractor. Other large organizations in California, such as Kaiser and Sutter, also use a medical foundation model. But the expense and expertise required to successfully run a medical foundation is a costly challenge for a small rural hospital, and the disconnect with the large medical foundation headquartered hundreds of miles away from the work site can be a source of frustration for the physicians they employ. The final area I wanted to touch on is the implications of healthcare reform on this discussion. For those of us in healthcare, this feels like a very turbulent time, and it is. The ACA has spawned ACOs, which is another way of saying that the Accountable Care Act or Obamacare has hastened the development of accountable care organizations. ACOs assume responsibility to coordinate care and improve care through the continuum of care. ACOs are successful to the extent that they can better integrate care. Because they are reimbursed to keep patients healthy, they are incentivized to consider alternative delivery models, such as team-based care and multidisciplinary approaches that complement and work alongside physicians. Large organizations are in a much better position to offer these services that are more comprehensive and nuanced than can be offered by independent practices. For example, rather than having patients coming in for a face-to-face appointment, which is by far the most important source of reimbursement for private practitioners as well as rural health clinics, rural hospitals could work with a visiting nurse agency to do outreach and improve compliance with recommended regimens. CMS is piloting programs that expand opportunities to support home care outreach and care coordination, so there are more opportunities to utilize these multidisciplinary teams in patient care. But the CMS program for chronic care requires patients to pay a copay for this coordination of services, which discourages many patients and clinicians from setting up these programs. Lifting the restrictions on critical access hospitals generally and rural hospitals in particular to directly hire physicians would allow our rural communities to modernize their healthcare delivery systems in line with the expectations of the Accountable Care Act. It would begin to level the playing field so that smaller rural hospitals could better compete on the basis of cost and quality. It would eliminate the contortions and duplications inherent in having to run both a medical foundation affiliated with the hospital and a separate HR process for all other employees, or having to rely on complicated time-limited salary guarantee packages that are risky for both physicians and hospitals. It would increase transparency for patients and consumers when choosing their healthcare provider by more clearly identifying who your physician works for, and would better position small rural hospitals to pull together a critical mass of physicians that would support sustainable work-life balances for all. There are many checks and balances in our system to protect physicians and the public from unethical practices, including regulatory bodies such as CMS, Medicare, the Joint Commission for Accreditation of Hospitals, and the California Department of Health. Other laws prohibit kickbacks for self-referrals would remain in place. Medical staff oversight of patient care would still occur, as would the reviews that occur at every level of our healthcare system, including medical service organizations, health plans, and insurance companies. And physicians in hospitals would still be subject to malpractice suits for improper care. In summary, the prohibition on critical access hospitals employing physicians is an unnecessary restriction. Physicians should have the ability to work for a hospital, just as they have the right to be hired by a community health center, join a medical foundation, or open a private practice. And critical access hospitals should have the same range of options to create a more efficient and effective healthcare delivery model that are so desperately needed. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Zeifler. That was insightful and very good. So if the CPM ban no longer existed, how would your staffing decisions be made? Would you change those decisions? Would they be, how would you form that hospital staffing if you didn't have to worry about that?
It would just be a more direct process, and it would be more transparent, and the physicians would be clear. Instead of working for, in our case, Physicians Network Medical Group, which is out of Sacramento, you'd be working directly with the hospital. It just is another card in your armamentarium to figure out what's best. So it's, some physicians want to be solo practitioners, some want to work in a group, they should just have those options. I think hospitals also should have those options, especially as we're being pushed towards more integration, more care coordination. To me, it's sort of an artificial, unnecessary, almost anachronistic barrier.
Very good. Thank you very much. Good afternoon, Mr. Flanagan.